In this lecture, we will be examining life for Americans on the home front during the Second World War. Unlike many previous wars in which the home front was less of an important factor, American workers on the home front played vitally important roles in the World War II war effort. In addition, a number of social, cultural, economic, and political changes that occurred after the Second World War were influenced by events on the home front during the war. Facing rapidly increasing food prices and wages, FDR submitted a radical bill to Congress in September 1942. He spoke to Americans that evening and warned of extreme inflation unless the government established price controls. He also described how the government needed to increase federal income tax rates to meet war costs. The Office of Price Administration was established, and this agency put in place price controls to help control inflation. These price controls kept prices in check, but they did create shortages and underground markets in commodities and goods. The Office of War and Mobilization encouraged Americans on the home front to plant what were known as victory gardens. These also gave American citizens a sense that they could contribute to the war effort in a meaningful way. At their peak, victory gardens grew up to 30 to 40% of all produce in the United States. The Office of Economic Stabilization was a new federal agency with extraordinary executive control over the U.S. economy. The cartoon here depicts FDR pulling sea vessels away from the shoals of doubt and toward a place called Port Prosperity, fictional place. To finance war spending, the U.S. government encouraged citizens to purchase war bonds. By borrowing money via war bonds, the U.S. government financed approximately 40% of the cost of the Second World War. However, the high levels of deficit spending also boosted the national debt fivefold from 1940 to 1945. This slide indicates some of the commodities that were rationed during the Second World War. The federal government issued rationing books for many consumer items. Civilians were permitted to buy these products only at certain times and only with a ration coupon. One of the side effects of rationing was the emergence of underground markets in products like tires, sugar, and butter. Attempts to shape public opinion via propaganda were not especially successful until after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The federal government used radio, newsreels, posters, and even worked with Hollywood producers to make films to help sway the American public to support the war. Some propaganda efforts used humor to shape public opinion. This cartoon takes a somewhat humorous take on the war efforts against Germany and Japan, though the image of Japanese Emperor Hirohito is rather racist by 21st century standards. Other forms of propaganda took a more serious tone, like this poster that discouraged gossiping and careless conversations that might accidentally provide information to enemy agents. This poster implies that the woman depicted put soldiers at risk with her gossip, and there's some interesting gender dynamics here that are being played off that women at the time believed to be not as reliable or perhaps not as easy to control their emotions. Some of these sexist stereotypes are very apparent in some of the propaganda from the time period. In terms of demonizing the enemy, perhaps the most effective forms of propaganda were those that demonized Axis enemies. German, Italian, and Japanese subjects in these propaganda pieces often took on subhuman or bloodthirsty qualities to subtly, or in some cases not so subtly, steer Americans into supporting the war effort. This cartoon suggests that workers who do not give 100% every day will please Japanese war planners. Theodor Geisel is best known to Americans these days as Dr. Seuss, the beloved author of many children's books. During the Second World War, however, he worked as a propagandist for the American government. Some of his cartoons contain images that, again, by 21st century standards might seem rather racist. This cartoon by Dr. Seuss depicts Japanese Americans as sort of robot-like terrorists or zombies whose loyalty was really with Japan and not with the United States, despite the fact that they may have been born in this country and some had never even set foot in Japan. This next Dr. Seuss cartoon suggests that if Americans did not purchase war bonds, Japan and Germany would take over the United States. Depicted here is Mount Rushmore, with Hitler and Hirohito carved on the side of the mountain, instead of the presidents who are there now. Not all American women wanted to join the workforce, and as the war started, there was considerable public resistance to the idea of mothers working in factories, again going up against established social norms of the time. This prevailing attitude contributed to the relatively low rate of women aged 25 to 34 who joined the labor force during World War II. For women who remained home, though, a shortage of steel brought home the realities of the war in a direct way. In 1943, civilians had been allotted only 15% of American steel production. This resulted in rationing of grocery items such as canned vegetables, canned fruits, canned soups, and canned juices. Women in larger cities were most directly affected by these steel shortages related to consumer goods, as women in the countryside could grow and preserve their own produce. Before the U.S. entered World War II, the government awarded a flurry of contracts to produce war equipment for the Allies. At first, American corporations did not worry about labor shortages, so they did not spend much time seeking female employees. Eventually, though, women were vital in the workforce because companies needed to meet strict deadlines to deliver merchandise for the war effort. At the time, most Americans believed women at work in war industries would only be a temporary phenomenon, and this was sort of a necessary evil. And it took a significant amount of propaganda to sell to Americans the idea of women working in factories. The fictional Rosie the Riveter, depicted here, a campaign, was the most successful of these efforts. Rosie was loyal, hardworking, patriotic, and yet possessed a physical beauty that was on par with Hollywood actresses. American women responded to the need for women in the workforce in many different ways, depending on their social class, their age, their race, or marital status. Women with many children, of course, found it much more difficult to work a full-time job and raise their families than women who were childless or had just one child. Approximately half of the women employed in war industries were minority and lower-class women already in the workforce. Many of these poorer women became upwardly mobile, moving quickly from low-paying jobs that were traditionally the province of women and into higher-paying factory jobs that once were almost exclusively geared toward men. The Second World War brought to the forefront of mainstream America a number of issues related to racial discrimination that had been largely ignored, at least by white America, prior to the war. African Americans began to question their second-class status, and the war actually aided their efforts to achieve racial equality. The WWII campaign was initiated by the newspaper The Pittsburgh Courier. This ad campaign celebrated the efforts of African Americans fighting for victory overseas while also fighting racism on the home front, so WWII for two types of victory. The WWII campaign was utilized on a national scale to attack discrimination against African Americans in defense-related companies. As the war opened, many American corporations and the federal government had continued to practice racial discrimination in the workplace. Civil rights leaders believed that FDR was not paying enough attention to their problems, and they threatened to organize a march on D.C. early in the war. FDR, feeling political pressure, issued an executive order that forced federal agencies in defense production to offer vocational and training programs without discrimination on the basis of, quote, race, creed, color, or national origin. But more importantly, though, all defense contracts were required to include stipulations that outlawed racial discrimination by defense contractors. After the start of the war, employers in Detroit turned to African Americans migrating for the South to help fill labor needs out of 350,000 new residents in Detroit by 1943. 50,000 of them were African Americans, most of whom were seeking lucrative factory work. This led, of course, to tensions between poor whites and poor blacks. One hot summer night in the year 1943, rumors began to circulate among black Detroiters that rowdy whites had thrown a black woman and her baby over a bridge on the Detroit River leading to Belle Isle. African Americans stormed into neighborhoods that had been all white in an era of segregated housing. A number of stores were looted and some buildings were destroyed. Simultaneously, white mobs in another neighborhood had been energized by rumors that a black man had raped and murdered a white woman on that same Belle Isle bridge. They too, in mob fashion, attacked black neighborhoods and stores. Eventually, 6,000 U.S. troops had to be ordered into the city to end the violence. There were about 34 people killed, 25 of whom were African Americans. Of the 600 injured, though, African Americans accounted for more than 75% of victims. And of 1,800 people arrested over the 3 days, African Americans represented about 85% of the detainees. So there was definitely a bias in terms of who was getting arrested and charged with disorderly conduct or rioting based on race. Similarly, in Los Angeles, a series of riots broke out between military personnel and the Mexican-American youths. On June 3rd, 1943, a group of inebriated servicemen on leave complained they had been assaulted by a gang of young Hispanic men. The soldiers rounded up a posse to help themselves. They went to East LA and they started attacking everyone they found wearing Zoot suits. This fashion was trendy among Mexican-American men, but was not exclusively a Mexican-American fashion at the time. Some young men wearing Zoot suits who were attacked by sailors and soldiers happened to be white as well. The drunken sailors and soldiers would tear off the expensive suits, burn the clothing in the street, and beat whoever they could find. Police intervened by arresting the beaten-up Mexican-American youths who were charged with disturbing the peace for having the audacity, I guess, to wear a nice suit in public and get beat up. Interestingly, many of the Los Angeles newspaper editorials praised these attacks. One editorial called the assaults a cleansing effect that cleared the city of miscreants and hoodlums. The federal government finally intervened on June 7th, in part at the prompting of Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady. The method used to defuse the riots was to declare LA off limits to all military personnel. However, the underlying tensions remained, and there were sporadic conflicts between whites and Hispanics throughout the war in the Los Angeles area. But perhaps no policy of the government or policy in general is representative of some of the inherent racism that was present during the war, as can be found in Executive Order 9066. On February 19th of 1942, the U.S. military was empowered to create so-called military zones. Any persons deemed to be a threat in these military zones could be removed and detained. The U.S. military designated the entire West Coast as a military zone, and the U.S. government started the forced removal of over 110,000 Japanese Americans from their homes. The War Relocation Authority, WRA, sent Japanese Americans, many of whom were second and third generation Americans, to relocation centers located in deserts of the American Southwest, as well as other parts of the United States. 120,000 Americans who happened to be of Japanese heritage were forced to live in one of these 10 internment camps. The facilities were officially called relocation centers, but they were really somewhat like prisons or concentration camps. The vast majority of detainees were full-fledged U.S. citizens. Many had been born in the United States, and many had never even traveled overseas to Japan. The camps were generally overcrowded, and living conditions at best were rather poor. It would not be until the 1980s that the U.S. government acknowledged this action and authorized reparations to the Japanese American detainees and their families. This map shows the location of the 10 internment centers where Japanese Americans were detained. You can see some as far east as Arkansas. And this brings to a close our brief examination of life on the American home front during the Second World War.